Sherlock Holmes and the Secret of the Golden Stiletto, Chapter 1. It was on a particularly dreary evening in late October that I first became aware of the case that would shake the very foundations of my rational mind. The gaslights along Baker Street burned dimly through the thick London fog, casting elongated shadows upon the pavement. Holmes sat opposite me in his armchair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his eyes half-lidded, but brimming with unspoken thought. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, warding off the autumn chill. A thick silence had settled between us, one that I, as ever, was the first to break. "You have been uncommonly quiet today, Holmes," I remarked, setting my tea aside. "I presume there is some enigma brewing beneath that impenetrable brow of yours." Holmes did not immediately respond. Instead, he reached for a folded letter upon the side table and flicked it toward me. "Read, Watson," he said, his voice laced with a curious detachment. "Tell me if you find the matter as disquieting as I do." I unfolded the parchment and scanned the elegant yet hastily scrawled handwriting. The letter was from Inspector Lestrade of Scotland Yard, brief, cryptic, and, as Holmes had suggested, profoundly unsettling. "Mr. Holmes, a most unusual matter has come to my attention. A man was found dead this morning in Kensington, stabbed through the heart with a peculiar golden stiletto. There are no witnesses, no apparent motive, and no evidence of forced entry. But that is not the strangest part. The man does not exist. There are no records of him at Scotland Yard, nor in any civil registry. No family, no profession, no address. His very name eludes us, and yet there he lies, undeniably dead. I would greatly appreciate your insight into this baffling affair. Inspector G. Lestrade." I lowered the letter, my brow furrowed. A man found dead, yet unknown to the world. I mused. Surely there must be some error in the records. Even the most obscure pauper has some trace in the annals of London's bureaucracy. Holmes tapped his fingers idly against the armrest. "And yet, Watson," he murmured, "what if there were no error? What if the records were never meant to exist?" A faint shiver ran down my spine. "That is preposterous," I scoffed, though my voice lacked conviction. "No man simply vanishes from history. There must be a logical explanation, perhaps an alias, or a deliberate effort to conceal this past." "Perhaps," Holmes said, but his gaze remained distant, as if peering into a mystery far beyond the limits of conventional reason. Then, as if suddenly animated by an invisible force, he leaped from his chair and snatched his overcoat. "Come, Watson," he declared, "let us not waste time debating ghosts when there is a corpse waiting for us at Scotland Yard." And with that, we stepped into the fog-drenched streets, unaware that we were about to embark upon a case unlike any other, a case that would make me question not only my own memory, but the very fabric of reality itself. Chapter 2. The carriage ride to Scotland Yard was conducted in near silence, save for the rhythmic clatter of hooves against the damp cobblestones. Holmes, as was his custom, sat with his gaze fixed upon the murky streets beyond the window, his sharp features cast in sharp relief against the flickering gaslights. His stillness was misleading. I knew from experience that his mind was anything but idle. For my part, I could not shake the lingering unease that had settled upon me since reading Lestrade's letter. A man murdered was grim enough, but a man without records, without history, without even a name. It was as though we were summoned not to investigate a crime, but to verify the existence of the victim himself. I cleared my throat. "Holmes, do you suspect that this man was deliberately erased from the record? If so, by whom? And to what end?" Holmes did not turn from the window, but his voice, when it came, was measured. "The question is not merely who erased him, Watson, but how and why. Surely the police are simply mistaken," I pressed. "Perhaps he was a foreigner, undocumented in our system." Holmes exhaled a slow breath, his fingers tightening briefly on his lapels. A plausible theory, but an incomplete one. We shall know more when we examine the body. Until then, keep your mind open to possibilities you may find uncomfortable. Before I could inquire further, the carriage slowed before the imposing edifice of Scotland Yard. The gaslights illuminated the thick fog curling around the entrance, as if the very city wished to conceal whatever secrets lay within. We disembarked and entered, the usual bureaucratic bustle greeting us. Lestrade was waiting in his office, his expression unusually grim. "Holmes, Watson," he greeted, his tone clipped. "This is a damned strange one, I tell you." He gestured for us to follow. "The body's in the morgue, but before we go down there, I need to show you something." He led us to a desk where several documents were laid out. These were the only things we found on him: a pocket watch, a set of keys, none matching any known residence, a small sum of money, and this. He handed Holmes a single sheet of paper. It was yellowed and creased as though frequently handled, but its surface was inexplicably blank. I frowned. An empty sheet. Lestrade nodded. "It looks like some kind of note, but there's nothing on it. No writing, no impressions left behind from erased words. Just nothing." Holmes held it up to the light, then brought it to his nose, inhaling slightly. His brows twitched, a flicker of interest sparking in his gaze. "Fascinating," he murmured. Lestrade crossed his arms. "Fascinating. It's an old scrap of paper." Holmes ignored him, slipping the sheet into his pocket before turning abruptly. "To the morgue, gentlemen. The dead do not often speak, but when they do, they rarely lie." The morgue was as cold and sterile as I remembered, its air thick with the scent of chemicals and preservation. The body of the unknown man lay upon a steel table, his shirt removed, revealing a single stab wound in his chest, clean, precise, directly through the heart. Holmes stepped forward, his hands tucked behind his back as he studied the corpse with an almost reverential silence. "Time of death?" he inquired. The coroner, a wiry man named Foster, adjusted his spectacles. "Sometime between midnight and 2 in the morning." Holmes nodded, then gestured toward the weapon on a tray beside the body, a slender golden stiletto, its hilt ornate, and its blade as thin as a needle. "A most unusual choice," he mused. "This is an assassin's weapon, meant for swift, silent kills. Not commonly found in the hands of your average criminal. It speaks of precision, purpose, and history." Lestrade scoffed. "History won't tell us who he was." Holmes' lips quirked into something that was not quite a smile. "No, but the body will." He reached forward, his fingers tracing along the deceased's forearm. Then he paused. "Watson," he said quietly, "look at this." I leaned in. At first, I saw nothing. Then, beneath the man's sleeve, I spotted it, a faint mark on the skin, almost invisible under the morgue's dim lighting. A brand. A symbol I had never seen before. Lestrade squinted. "What the devil is that?" Holmes was silent for a long moment. Then, with a gravity that made my skin prickle, he murmured, "It is the mark of an organization that should not exist." Chapter 3. A heavy silence settled over the morgue as Holmes traced the faint brand on the dead man's arm with a careful fingertip. The mark, nearly imperceptible in the dim light, took the shape of an Ouroboros, a serpent devouring its own tail. Though unlike the traditional symbol, this one was incomplete, broken at the midpoint. Lestrade, peering over my shoulder, let out a low whistle. "Well, I don't recognize it. Some secret society nonsense, I suppose." Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket, retrieving his magnifying lens. He bent closer to the mark, his keen gaze studying every detail with the precision of a jeweler appraising a rare stone. "Watson, standing beside him, felt a chill prickle his skin. There was something deeply unsettling about the brand, not just its mystery, but the sense that it had been deliberately concealed. "It is not merely some obscure symbol," Holmes murmured at last. "It is a signature." Lestrade scoffed. "Signature? Of who?" Holmes straightened, slipping the lens back into his coat. His expression was unreadable. "That," he said, "is what we must determine." The coroner, Foster, cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "I was hoping you could explain it to me, Mr. Holmes. I've examined many bodies, but I've never seen anything like this. What sort of organization brands its members, only for them to vanish from history entirely?" Holmes glanced at the golden stiletto once more. "The sort that ensures its secrets remain buried even beyond death." Lestrade exhaled sharply. "Right, well, that's all very dramatic, but we need something solid. This man's name, his connections, anything." Holmes turned toward the body again, his gaze sharpening. "There is one more matter to consider, the means of his death." He gestured toward the wound. A single precise stab to the heart. No hesitation, no second attempt. A clean execution. I folded my arms, examining the scene with the physician's eye. It suggests either a highly skilled killer or one intimately familiar with the victim. Holmes nodded. "Indeed, but there is something else. Look closely at the edges of the wound." I leaned in, then frowned. "It's unusual. The tissue isn't merely cut, it's almost cauterized." Holmes smiled faintly. "Exactly, Watson. The blade of the stiletto is peculiar. It is too fine to create a wound with such a distinct, almost burned outline." "Which suggests—" "A prepared weapon," I finished. "Dipped in some substance, an agent designed to obscure evidence, or something more insidious," Holmes murmured. "A blade that carries more than just death. It carries erasure." Lestrade, arms still folded, shifted uncomfortably. "I don't like where this is going, Holmes. This is beginning to sound less like a murder and more like—" He hesitated, reluctant to finish the thought. "More like an execution," Holmes supplied smoothly. I stiffened. The words settled over the room like a heavy shroud. Lestrade grunted. "So, what's next? If he doesn't exist on paper, how do we find out who he was?" Holmes turned away from the corpse, his gaze distant. "We must look beyond official records. If a man is erased from history, we must find those who remember him, not in ledgers, but in whispers." As we left the morgue, stepping back into the fog-laden streets of London, I couldn't shake the lingering unease in my bones. Holmes, ever purposeful, strode ahead with his usual swiftness, his thoughts clearly racing. "Holmes, you mentioned looking beyond records," I said, quickening my pace to match his. "Who do you intend to question?" "A man may be erased from the annals of bureaucracy, Watson, but he cannot be erased from the minds of those who have known him," he replied. "And there is one place in London where even the most forgotten men leave an impression." Lestrade, following close behind, groaned. "You're not talking about that blasted informant of yours, are you?" Holmes did not respond directly, but I already knew the answer. We were going to see the one man in London who knew the city's shadows better than anyone else. We were going to see Langley Pike. Chapter 4. Night had deepened over London, and the fog had thickened into a near impenetrable shroud as we made our way through the twisting alleys of Whitehall. The street lamps flickered uncertainly, their dim glow swallowed by the mist. The air carried the stench of damp brick, soot, and the distant scent of unwashed bodies huddled in the dark corners of the city. Langley Pike's domain was not the refined drawing-rooms of Mayfair, nor the stately halls of the aristocracy. No, his was a kingdom of filth and whispers, an underworld built on secrets exchanged for coin. He was an informant unlike any other, one who traded not in goods but in knowledge. A man who knew every name worth knowing in London, and more than a few that were not. Holmes led us through the maze of back streets with unerring precision, his sharp gaze flicking over every shifting shadow. At last, we reached a nondescript wooden door set into the crumbling brickwork of a nameless building. Holmes rapped twice, pause, then 3 more times, a peculiar rhythm. The door creaked open, revealing a thin, rat-faced man with a crooked grin and eyes that glittered with amusement. "Well, well," he rasped, his voice carrying the telltale scrape of pipe smoke and cheap gin. "Mr. Holmes, ain't seen you in a spell." Holmes stepped past him into the dimly lit interior without hesitation. "Spare me the pleasantries, Pike. We require information." Pike let out a chuckle, his wiry frame barely shifting as Lestrade and I followed Holmes inside. The room was a chaos of discarded newspapers, yellowed maps, and ink-stained ledgers stacked haphazardly upon a battered desk. A single oil lamp cast flickering shadows across the walls, making the place seem even smaller than it was. Pike moved to a chair by the desk, sinking into it lazily. "You know the price, detective." He rubbed his thumb against his fingertips in a universal gesture of greed. Holmes reached into his coat, withdrawing a few coins. Pike snatched them with the speed of a pickpocket, biting one absent-mindedly before pocketing them. "Now then," he drawled, "who's got you lot chasing ghosts this time?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he removed a folded sheet of paper from his pocket, the same blank note that had been found on the corpse. He unfolded it carefully and laid it upon the table. Pike peered at it, then snorted. "Hate to break it to you, but that's not much of a clue, Holmes." Holmes merely observed him. "And yet you recognized it immediately." Pike's smirk faltered, just for a moment. "Never said that." Lestrade exhaled sharply. "Enough games, Pike. We need a name. The man was murdered, stabbed through the heart with a golden stiletto, and there's not a single record of him existing. You telling me no one in your little network knows anything?" Pike scratched at his chin, eyes flicking to Holmes. "You ever hear of the Veiled Order?" The name sent a chill down my spine, though I did not know why. It carried a weight to it, an unspoken sense of something forbidden. Holmes, for the first time that evening, was perfectly still. "The Veiled Order," he repeated, his voice devoid of inflection. Pike nodded slowly. "Old as dust." "Older, maybe. They don't just erase people from records, Mr. Holmes. They erase 'em from memory." I stiffened. "That's absurd. A man cannot simply be forgotten." Pike finished, grinning. "Happens more than you'd think, Doctor. See, the Order ain't like a normal gang or some secret club. They don't just kill a man. They remove him, like he was never there. You ever met someone you could swear you knew, but you can't recall their name? Ever read something important, only to find the words slipping out of your mind the moment you look away?" He leaned forward, his grin widening. "That's them." I shuddered involuntarily. There was something deeply unnerving about the casual way Pike spoke of it, as if he were discussing a simple exchange of money rather than something unnatural. Holmes, however, remained unaffected, and the brand on our victim's arm. Pike hesitated. "That's their mark. Means he was one of them. But see, here's the thing." He drummed his fingers on the desk. "Hain't nobody ever left the Order alive. Not unless the Order wanted 'em to." Lestrade scoffed. "And yet here we are staring at a corpse." Pike shook his head. "A dead man, yeah. But a free man? That's different." Holmes tapped his fingers together, his mind clearly working through a dozen possibilities at once. Finally he asked, "Where would we find someone who remembers him?" Pike hesitated, his expression guarded. "There's only one place, but you won't like it." Holmes smiled faintly. "That, Pike, is where you are most mistaken. Lead on." Chapter 5. The rain had begun to fall in a slow, relentless drizzle by the time we emerged from Pike's den. It pattered against the cobblestones in a dull rhythm, turning the already thick fog into a near impenetrable wall. Pike led the way, his wiry frame hunched against the cold, his movements quick and wary, as though he feared unseen eyes watching from the gloom. Holmes walked beside him, silent and focused, while Lestrade trailed slightly behind, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. I stayed close, my unease growing with each step. Pike had not told us our destination outright, only that it was a place where memory lingers. When at last he spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "You ever hear of Blackwood Lane?" Holmes inclined his head slightly. "I am aware of it. A street known more by omission than reputation." Pike nodded. "Aye, 'cause it ain't on no map. Not any more." Lestrade frowned. "What do you mean, not any more?" Pike sighed, shaking his head. "Blackwood Lane was once a proper street years back. Had houses, shops, a little post office. But one day, poof. No records, no deeds, no mention in the city ledgers. Ask any bloke on the street, and they won't record it ever existed." I scoffed. "That's preposterous. A street cannot simply disappear." Pike shot me a knowing grin. "Funny, ain't it? That's exactly what folks said about our dead man." Holmes remained impassive. "And yet you claim it is still there." "Oh, it's there, all right," Pike muttered, "if you know where to look." He led us through a series of twisting alleyways, the buildings around us growing older, more dilapidated, as though we were walking backward through time itself. The streets, which had once been bustling with life, were eerily silent here. No carriages, no late-night workers, no stray dogs sniffing at the gutters, only the steady whisper of rain against stone. At last, we reached a narrow passageway wedged between two ancient buildings, a place I could have sworn had not been there moments ago. Pike stopped and gestured toward it. Blackwood Lane. Holmes stepped forward first, his sharp eyes scanning the alleyway. I hesitated, staring into the darkness beyond. There was something profoundly unnatural about the passage, as though it resisted being noticed, as though the very act of seeing it was an intrusion. Holmes glanced back at me. "Come, Watson. The only way to disprove the impossible is to confront it directly." With that, he stepped forward, vanishing into the passage. I swallowed hard and followed. The lane was unlike any place I had ever seen in London. The air itself seemed heavier, thick with the scent of old stone and damp earth. Buildings loomed on either side, their facades cracked and forgotten, their windows empty and dark. The street was unnaturally still, as if the very wind had been barred from entering. But the strangest thing, the thing that sent ice creeping up my spine, was the house. At the end of the lane stood a 3-story manor, its blackened bricks covered in ivy, its roof sagging under years of neglect. It was a house that should not exist. Lestrade muttered a curse under his breath. "No one's lived in that place for decades, I'd wager." Pike chuckled dryly. "Not officially, no." Holmes walked toward it without hesitation. "And yet I suspect it has had tenants of a sort." I swallowed against the lump forming in my throat. "You truly mean to enter?" Holmes did not look back. "Naturally, Watson. We came here for answers, and answers rarely present themselves in the open air." With that, he stepped up to the weathered wooden door, reached out, and pushed it open. It did not creak. It did not resist. It simply yielded, as though it had been waiting for us all along. And then, with a gust of cold air, we stepped inside. Chapter 6. The moment we stepped inside, the temperature dropped. Not the damp chill of a neglected building, nor the creeping cold of London's autumn. This was something else, something unnatural. It clung to the walls, to the air itself, pressing against my skin like unseen hands. The hallway before us stretched into darkness, lined with faded wallpaper that peeled at the edges. Dust lay thick upon the wooden floor, undisturbed by footprints, as though no living soul had walked these halls in years. And yet the house did not feel abandoned. It felt aware. Holmes moved first, his sharp gaze sweeping over every surface, every shadow. I followed, my pulse quickening, while Lestrade lingered near the door, his fingers flexing at his sides. Pike, to my mild surprise, had vanished entirely. "Charming place," Lestrade muttered, his voice low. "I don't suppose we can count on the owners for a warm welcome." Holmes ignored him. Instead, he reached into his coat and withdrew a small case, flipping it open to reveal a pocket lantern. A strike of flint, a twist of the wick, and the dim glow of firelight flickered across the walls. The light revealed something I wished it hadn't. Paintings. They lined the corridor, their gilt frames dulled by age, their subjects staring outward with vacant expressions. At first glance, they seemed unremarkable, portraits of nameless men and women in Victorian attire. But as I studied them, a deep unease took hold. "Holmes," I murmured, "these paintings, something is wrong with them." He stepped closer, tilting the lantern toward the nearest portrait. The man depicted was young, with neatly combed hair and sharp features. But his eyes held something unnatural. Not mere pigment on canvas, but a presence. I could not explain it, but the more I looked, the more I felt I was being watched in return. Lestrade cleared his throat. "Nothing odd about old paintings, is there?" Holmes turned to him, his expression unreadable. "These are not old paintings, Lestrade. They are new." I felt my stomach drop. "That's impossible. They're covered in dust." Holmes brushed his fingers over the nearest frame, then lifted them to the light. No dust, no age. The paintings had not faded. They had been placed here recently. "Someone has been maintaining this house," Holmes murmured, "and yet it has not been lived in." I glanced back toward the door, half expecting Pike to have returned. But the street beyond was swallowed by mist, the entrance framed in darkness. I felt a sudden irrational certainty. If we left now, we might never find this house again. Holmes moved onward without hesitation, the glow of his lantern casting long shadows as we proceeded into the main hallway. Then something changed. A sound. Faint, distant, the echo of a whisper just at the edge of hearing. I stopped in my tracks. "Did you hear that?" Lestrade frowned. "Hear what?" Holmes, however, had gone completely still. His head was tilted slightly, his sharp gaze unfocused, as if listening to something beyond our perception. Then, just as suddenly, he stepped forward, leading us toward a set of heavy wooden doors at the end of the corridor. They bore no markings, no locks, only an air of quiet expectancy. Holmes reached out, placing a hand against the surface. Then, without a word, he pushed. The doors swung open soundlessly, and inside, the past awaited. Chapter 7. The doors swung inward, revealing a dimly lit chamber beyond. The moment we stepped inside, the sensation of being watched intensified. It was no longer a mere trick of the mind. It was an oppressive force, as if unseen figures lurked just beyond the veil of darkness, observing our every movement. The room was unlike anything I had expected. It was a study, lined with towering bookshelves filled with tomes that defied time. Some bore gilded lettering in ancient Latin, others were bound in strange materials that did not resemble leather or cloth. A heavy oak desk stood at the center, and upon it lay an array of scattered papers, an unlit candle, and, most disturbingly, an identical golden stiletto to the one found in the morgue. Lestrade let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. Another one." Holmes moved without hesitation, his long fingers brushing over the handle of the stiletto. "Not another, Lestrade. The same." I blinked. The same, but we left the original at Scotland Yard. Holmes nodded. Precisely. The implications of his statements sent a cold shiver down my spine. I turned my gaze to the desk, scanning the scattered papers. Unlike the empty note found on the victim, these bore writing, though the ink was faded, as if time had been leaching the words away. Holmes lifted one page and brought it to the lantern's glow. His eyes flicked across the words, his expression unreadable. To those who find this, you must remember, the order's reach is infinite. Memory is a fragile thing. When you forget, you are lost. Do not let them take it all. Do not let them erase. The rest of the sentence had been violently scratched out. Lestrade cursed under his breath. This is bloody unsettling, Holmes. Who the hell were these people? And why go through so much trouble to wipe them from existence? Holmes turned his gaze toward the bookshelves. That, Lestrade, is what we must uncover before the knowledge itself is lost. He strode toward the shelves, fingers dancing over the spines of the books, as if searching for something specific. I glanced at the desk once more, my pulse quickening. Among the papers was a name. Not just any name. A name I recognized. Holmes, I whispered, my throat tightening. This letter, it bears your name. Holmes stilled. Slowly he turned back to me. Lestrade stepped forward, frowning as he peered over my shoulder. That can't be right, he muttered. But it was. There, in the same fading ink, were the words, Sherlock Holmes must not remember. Chapter 8. A silence followed my words, heavy and unnatural. Holmes took the paper from my hands, his keen gaze scanning the fading ink. His fingers, steady as ever, gripped the fragile document with uncharacteristic intensity. Lestrade, he said softly, what is the date on this letter? Lestrade frowned, squinting at the bottom of the page. That's odd. There isn't one. Holmes exhaled sharply through his nose. Then we must assume the worst. I swallowed. And what, precisely, would that be? Holmes set the paper down, his fingers briefly pressing against his temple. That this is not a warning from the past, Watson. It is a warning from the present. A chill ran through me. The room suddenly felt too small, the candlelight too dim. But how is that possible? I asked. This letter, it's aged, the ink is faded. It must have been written years ago. Holmes merely shook his head. No, time is irrelevant in this place. That is the true nature of the order, Watson. It is not merely that they erase men from history. They erase history from men. Lestrade cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Right, I don't like this. This is feeling less like a case and more like some ghost story from the penny dreadfuls. Holmes ignored him. His eyes flicked toward the bookshelves once more. We do not have much time. If this place exists outside conventional history, it will not allow us to remember for long. He strode forward, scanning the rows of books with renewed urgency. I turned back to the desk, trying to make sense of what little remained. The pages were crumbling, the ink so faint that some words had already vanished. Then something peculiar happened. The letter, the one bearing Holmes' name, was changing. I blinked. A moment ago, the words had been clear enough to read. But now, the ink had faded further, the last line almost indecipherable. Sherlock, I said slowly. He did not turn. The letter, it's fading. Holmes was at my side in an instant, his sharp gaze scanning the page. It was no illusion. The ink was disappearing before our very eyes. Lestrade swore. What in the devil? Holmes snatched up the letter, his fingers tightening around it. His expression, for the first time, held something close to unease. They know we are here, he murmured. The candle flickered violently. A shadow passed through the room, not across the walls, nor the ceiling, but through the very air itself, like the memory of movement rather than movement itself. Then, from the hallway beyond, a whisper, not words, not voices, just the sound of something remembering that we existed. Holmes moved first. We must go. Now. Lestrade needed no further encouragement. I followed close behind as Holmes extinguished the lantern, plunging the study into darkness. As we reached the door, I turned for one final glance at the room. The desk, the bookshelves, the papers, all of it was gone. Chapter 9. We fled. Not in the reckless panic of men pursued by blade or bullet, but with the measured urgency of those who understood that something unseen was reaching for them. The house had changed. The corridor we had entered was no longer the same. The paintings that had lined the walls were gone. The air had thickened, pressing down upon us like a living thing. Lestrade was muttering curses under his breath, his pace quick and unsteady. I could hear my own breathing, rapid and shallow, but Holmes was silent, focused. His mind, I knew, was racing faster than his feet. As we reached the main hall, the doors ahead loomed impossibly distant. The very architecture of the house was shifting, elongating. The exit, that should have been mere steps away, now stretched down a narrowing passage, as though the walls themselves resisted our departure. "This is impossible," I gasped. Holmes glanced at me. "No, Watson, this is deliberate." The whispering returned, not from behind us, nor ahead, but from everywhere. It did not speak words. It did not need to. It was a presence, a force pressing against the edges of our thoughts, slipping into the crevices of memory. I gritted my teeth, forcing myself to focus. "What is it?" Holmes' voice was quiet, measured, a mechanism of inertia. "We were not meant to leave with what we have learned." Lestrade paled. "Then let's bloody well forget and get out of here." Too late for that. Holmes suddenly seized my arm, pulling me to a stop. "Watson, tell me, what were we investigating?" I blinked. "What?" "The case, Watson. The victim. His name. Tell me." I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. A hollow, sinking feeling spread through my chest. I grasped at my mind, at the facts I knew had been there, but it was like trying to catch mist in my fingers. The moment I tried to focus, the details slipped away. The man. The golden stiletto. Blackwood Lane. I could remember the events, but not the meaning behind them. Lestrade swayed slightly, rubbing his temple. I don't. Bloody hell, what's happening to me?" Holmes' grip tightened. "We must act quickly." With a sharp motion, he reached into his coat and withdrew something small, pressing it into my palm. A scrap of parchment. "Do not let go of this," he ordered. I glanced down. The paper held only a few words, scrawled in Holmes' precise hand. The veiled order, the golden stiletto, the erased man. Do not forget. The moment I read it, the missing details crashed back into my mind. It was like resurfacing from deep water, gasping for air I hadn't realized I'd lost. Lestrade had one too. His face twisted in confusion, then horror. "What? How is this?" "A simple principle," Holmes said, striding forward. "They cannot erase what is written so long as we remain conscious of it. But that window is closing." The walls trembled. The whispering grew sharper, more insistent. Then, from somewhere deep within the house, a sound. A footstep. Slow, deliberate. Not behind us. Ahead. Holmes inhaled sharply. "We are not the only ones here." Lestrade had drawn his revolver before I had time to react. "Who's there?" he barked. His voice was firm, but I could see the sweat forming on his brow. Silence. Then, another footstep. Holmes moved first. His hand found my shoulder, guiding me toward the corridor that still led, distorted as it was, toward the exit. "Move," he ordered. We did. The house did not want us to. The distance stretched and shrank in unnatural ways, forcing us forward in bursts of movement that felt disjointed, like a half-remembered dream. And behind us the footsteps followed, not hurried, not panicked, steady, patient. Something did not need to chase us. It only needed to ensure that when we left, we would take nothing with us. We reached the door. Holmes threw it open. The cold air of London's streets hit me like a slap to the face. I stumbled forward, Lestrade right behind me, his breath ragged. Holmes was last to cross the threshold. The moment his foot left the house, the whispering stopped. The door vanished. We turned. There was no house, no Blackwood Lane, only the empty alley where we had first entered. Lestrade was shaking. We were just, it was here. Holmes exhaled slowly, his expression unreadable. He reached into his coat, retrieving his scrap of parchment. His gaze flicked over the words he had written, words that still remained. "The test worked," he murmured. I swallowed against the tightness in my throat. What was that? Holmes turned to me. His face was as sharp and unyielding as ever, but in his eyes, deep in their dark recesses, I saw something else. Something I had rarely seen before. Not fear. Something far worse. Understanding. He met my gaze. It was a warning, Watson. Then more quietly, and a promise. Chapter 10. The alley was deathly silent. The house, if it had ever been there, was gone. Lestrade turned in a slow circle, his breath still ragged. "This is madness," he muttered. We were just there. That house, it existed. Holmes pocketed the scrap of paper and turned his gaze toward the fog-laden street beyond. It did, and it didn't. I exhaled, rubbing my temple. My thoughts felt disjointed, my mind struggling to hold on to the events of the past hour. Holmes, if the house was erased, then how do we still remember it? Holmes glanced at me, his features unreadable. Then, without a word, he withdrew his pocket watch, flipped it open, and studied the timepiece with sharp intensity. A beat passed, then another. Finally he spoke. "We don't." Lestrade and I exchanged uneasy glances. I took a step forward. "Holmes, what are you?" He held up a hand to silence me, his eyes never leaving the watch. Then, with precise, deliberate movements, he reached into his coat and retrieved his notebook. He flipped through the pages, his brows furrowing slightly. Then he stopped, closed the notebook, slipped it back into his pocket, turned to me. "Watson, what were we investigating?" The question sent a chill through me. I opened my mouth, ready to respond. Then nothing. My throat tightened. I knew the answer. I had to know. But the words, the very knowledge itself, was slipping through my grasp. I blinked rapidly, my pulse quickening. There was a murder. A man. The golden. I faltered. Lestrade's expression darkened. "Holmes," he said slowly, "I remember being in that house. I remember something. But—" He hesitated, jaw clenching. "Damn it, I should know this." Holmes exhaled sharply, slipping his watch back into his coat. "The effect is worsening. They did not erase us, but they are erasing the knowledge we stole. Memory is malleable. Reality is malleable. And the veiled order ensures that only what they wish to remain remains." I clenched my fists. "Then how are you still remembering?" Holmes smiled faintly. I never trusted my mind to memory alone. I frowned, watching as he once again retrieved his notebook. This time he handed it to me. "Read," he instructed. I took the notebook with slightly trembling hands, flipping to the page he had marked. The words were written in Holmes' familiar, precise script. A man erased. The veiled order. The golden stiletto. The house on Blackwood Lane. I stared at the words. And then the memory returned. Not all of it, not the details, but the awareness, the context. The moment my eyes traced the ink, the fog in my mind receded, and I knew with absolute certainty that something had been taken from me. Lestrade peered over my shoulder, reading the words as well. His breath hitched, his pupils dilating slightly. He swayed for a brief moment, then steadied himself. "Bloody hell," he muttered. "It's true. We were forgetting." I swallowed thickly, closing the notebook. Holmes, this is unlike anything we've faced before. Holmes' sharp eyes locked onto mine, precisely why we must finish what we started. Lestrade let out a humorless laugh. And how do you expect to do that when we're up against something that can rewrite reality? Holmes slipped the notebook back into his coat by refusing to play by their rules. His gaze flicked toward the fog-choked street beyond. "Come, gentlemen, we have an order to dismantle." And with that he strode forward, vanishing into the mist. Chapter 11. The streets of London swallowed us whole. The mist curled in thick waves, suffocating the gaslight glow and reducing the world to a narrow corridor of shifting grey. Holmes led the way, his stride swift, purposeful. Lestrade and I followed, our thoughts weighed down by the terrible realization that we were fighting something far greater than flesh and blood adversaries. The veiled order did not kill men. They erased them. And if we failed, we would suffer the same fate, not through violence, but through oblivion. We arrived at Baker Street just past midnight. The familiar sight of 221B was a small comfort, though the knowledge that even our own memories could not be trusted left me feeling unsteady. Mrs. Hudson, bless her, had fallen asleep in the sitting-room, her knitting draped across her lap. Holmes moved past her without a word, leading us up the stairs to the sanctuary of his study. Once inside, he locked the door. Then, without preamble, he pulled out his notebook, flipped it open, and laid it on the desk. "Our minds cannot be trusted," he declared. "We must record everything." I hesitated. But how do we know they will not erase what we write? Holmes' gaze flicked to mine. "Because, Watson, I do not intend for our records to remain in one place." He turned to Lestrade. "Take a page. Write down everything you remember. Do it now, before it fades again." Lestrade scowled, but did as he was told. I followed suit, scrawling the details of our investigation as fast as my hand could move. The erasure was insidious. I found myself struggling to recall what had occurred just hours ago. Certain details, our victim's name, the layout of the house on Blackwood Lane, slipped through my mind like sand through my fingers. I gritted my teeth and focused harder. Ink does not forget. Ink does not fade. Holmes, meanwhile, was preparing something else. From his desk, he withdrew several envelopes. Inside each, he placed a single page of notes, sealing them with wax. Lestrade frowned. "What are those?" Holmes did not look up. "A contingency. If we fall victim to the order's methods, these letters will remain." I swallowed. "But to whom are you sending them?" For the first time that night, a ghost of a smile crossed Holmes' lips. "To men who cannot be erased." He handed one to Lestrade, another to me. "Keep them with you at all times. Do not open them unless your memories fail entirely. And most importantly," his voice dropped, his gaze darkening, "do not let them be taken." A weight settled in my chest. The implication was clear. If the Order knew we possessed these written records, they would come for them. And for us. The clock on the mantel chimed once. Holmes exhaled and stood. "That is enough for tonight. We must rest while we can." Lestrade rubbed his face, exhaustion catching up with him. Rest? You expect me to bloody sleep after that? You must, Holmes said simply. For if we fail, there will be no waking. I did not ask him to clarify. We did not speak of the whispering shadows. We did not speak of the vanished house. We did not speak of the fact that, for all our efforts, we still did not know who had died, or if he had ever lived at all. I sat by the window, watching the fog slither through the streets. Somewhere beyond it, something was watching back. Waiting. Chapter 12. Sleep did not come easily. Despite the warmth of the fire crackling in the hearth, an unnatural chill lingered in the air. I sat in my chair, eyes half-lidded, but my mind refused to surrender to exhaustion. The events of the night replayed in jagged fragments, the vanishing house, the whispering presence, the name of the victim slipping like water through my fingers. Somewhere in the dim haze of my thoughts, a dreadful realization stirred. The order did not just erase the past. It rewrote it. I awoke to the scent of burning paper. Jerking upright, I found Holmes standing by the fireplace, a single sheet of parchment curling to blackened ash between his fingers. His face was unreadable, though his knuckles had turned white around the page. I shot to my feet. "Holmes, what are you doing?" He released the final fragment of charred paper and turned to me. "A test, Watson." I strode forward, glancing into the hearth. Whatever had been written was now gone. "You burned a page of your notes." Holmes met my gaze evenly. "Not my notes." A cold weight settled in my gut. Lestrade, who had been roused by the commotion, frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" Holmes slowly reached into his pocket, withdrew his notebook, and flipped to the section where we have recorded our findings. I leaned in, my breath hitching. There was a blank page. No, not blank. Erased. The ink had faded entirely, as though it had never existed. Only a faint indentation remained where the pen had pressed against the paper. Lestrade swore. No, that was there last night. I saw you write it myself." Holmes' expression was unreadable. "Yes, and now it is gone." I swallowed hard. "Holmes, did you remove it?" He tapped a single finger against the page. "If I had, the indentation would not remain. The ink is what has vanished selectively. Not the memory of it, not the page itself, just the words." My mind reeled. "Then they know." Holmes nodded. "They know." A silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken horror. Finally, Lestrade exhaled through his nose and squared his shoulders. "All right, so they got to the ink, but not to us. What's next?" Holmes closed the notebook and pocketed it. "The game has changed. If the records we create are not safe, then we must take a different approach." I frowned. "And what approach is that?" Holmes turned away, stepping toward the window. Outside, the London streets were just beginning to stir with the dawn, but the fog remained. A silent observer to the madness we had uncovered. We must find the man who never was. Chapter 13. London had awoken, but it did not feel alive. The streets were as they had always been. Horse-drawn cabs rattling over damp cobblestones, street vendors hawking their wares, beggars lingering in alleyways. But something was missing. I could not name it, yet I felt its absence all the same. A hollowness in the city's rhythm, as though a note in a familiar tune had been struck out, leaving only an unplaceable discord. Holmes walked ahead, his coat billowing slightly as he cut through the morning mist. Lestrade and I followed in silence, each of us nursing the same quiet horror that had taken root in our minds. We had discovered a crime unlike any other. But if the order had its way, we would not even remember what had been stolen. "Where are we going?" Lestrade asked, his voice edged with unease. Holmes did not look back. "To find what remains of the erased man." Lestrade scoffed. "Oh, that's rich. We barely remember him ourselves. Which is precisely why we must search elsewhere, Holmes replied. If a man is removed from existence, he cannot leave records, nor letters, nor official ties. But men do not live in isolation. They leave impressions, imprints upon those they encounter. That is where we must look. I frowned. You mean witnesses? Holmes nodded. Of a sort. And where exactly do you expect to find such people? Lestrade pressed. Holmes' stride never slowed. Among those who live on the margins of memory. 20 minutes later, we arrived at a grimy little establishment nestled between two larger buildings on the fringes of Whitechapel. The sign above the door was so worn that its lettering had faded into obscurity, but I knew the type well enough. A place for those who did not wish to be found. Holmes entered first. The moment we stepped inside, the stench of pipe smoke and damp wood filled my nostrils. A few patrons slumped over tables, barely lifting their heads at our arrival. The bartender, a stout man with a scar bisecting his cheek, regarded us with mild disinterest. Holmes approached him without hesitation. We require information. The bartender grunted. That's so. Information ain't free. Holmes slid a few coins across the counter. Nor should it be. The man pocketed them without looking. What do you need? Holmes leaned in slightly. We seek a man who has been erased. Something shifted in the bartender's expression. He didn't move, didn't speak, but for the briefest moment I saw something flicker behind his eyes, something wary. I don't deal in ghosts, he muttered. Holmes smiled thinly. Ghosts leave no footprints, no debts, no whispers in places like this. He tapped a gloved finger against the counter. A man was killed. A man who, by all accounts, never existed. You know what I am asking. The bartender exhaled sharply, then reached for a glass, polishing it with deliberate slowness. People like that, they don't come through here often, but when they do, they're always running from something. Holmes nodded. And what was he running from? The bartender hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, his own shadow. The chill crept down my spine. Lestrade straightened. What the devil does that mean? The bartender shook his head. Dunno, but I remember the way he acted. Kept looking over his shoulder, flinching at nothing, drank too much. Muttered things under his breath, things I didn't want to understand. I swallowed. His name. The bartender hesitated again. Then, I don't remember. His brow furrowed as he spoke, as if confused by his own answer. His grip on the glass tightened. That ain't right. I knew his name. I served him. He was just here a few nights ago. Holmes watched him intently. And yet you cannot recall it now. The bartender's breath quickened. No, that ain't right. I should know. Then he stiffened. A strange stillness came over him. His pupils dilated slightly. And just like that, the tension vanished from his face. His expression smoothed over, as if the last few moments had not occurred at all. He blinked once. Then, in a completely neutral voice, he asked, "What were we talking about?" The dreadful silence followed. I felt the blood drain from my face. Lestrade swore under his breath. Holmes, however, merely exhaled through his nose. It is worse than I feared. The bartender looked at him blankly. Something wrong, sir? Holmes smiled thinly. Not at all. Good evening. He turned on his heel and strode toward the exit. Lestrade and I followed, our steps hurried. Only when we had stepped outside did I allow myself to breathe again. Lestrade ran a hand through his hair. All right, I'm officially out. This is sorcery. It's the devil's work. Holmes ignored him. His sharp gaze swept the street, his mind already working ahead. I exhaled. Holmes, what did we just witness? Holmes' voice was quiet, an active correction. Lestrade frowned. "What?" Holmes' gaze darkened. "The order does not merely erase men, Watson. It erases traces of them. It is not enough to remove their records or their bodies. They must remove the very memory of their existence from all who knew them." The bartender? He was adjusted as soon as he began to recall something he was not meant to. I shuddered. "Then, how long until we are corrected?" Holmes met my gaze. His answer was simple. "Not long." The weight of those words pressed down upon me. If we did not solve this mystery soon, we would not only lose the case, we would lose ourselves. Chapter 14. We stood in the damp streets of Whitechapel, the air thick with the stench of soot and wet stone. Around us, London churned on, oblivious to the unravelling reality beneath its feet. The bartender had forgotten. His mind had been rewritten before our eyes. And soon we would be next. Lestrade wiped a hand down his face. "This is madness, Holmes. How do we fight something that can edit our memories like ink on a page?" Holmes remained silent. His gaze flickered toward his notebook, tucked safely in his coat pocket, the only thing anchoring us to the truth. Then, as if reaching some unspoken conclusion, he turned on his heel. "Watson, Lestrade," he said briskly, "we have only one recourse left." I straightened. "And that is?" He adjusted his coat and strode forward into the fog. "We must confront the order directly." We took a hansom cab through the twisting arteries of the city, the wheels splashing through murky puddles as we wound our way toward an unknown destination. Holmes remained tight-lipped. He had not told us where we were going, nor what he expected to find, and I knew better than to press him. His mind worked faster than most, and his conclusions were often reached long before the rest of us even knew which way to look. Lestrade, however, was not so patient. "Holmes, I'd rather not go into this blind. Where exactly are we headed?" Holmes' expression remained unreadable, to the only place that can answer our questions. I frowned. "And where might that be?" His gaze met mine. "The Mirror House." I had heard whispers of the place before, though never by name. An establishment hidden within London's underbelly, known only to those who dealt in secrets. A house where men came and left different than they were before. The order's hand had touched many places, but if rumours were to be believed, this place did not forget. The cab stopped in an unremarkable alley, lined with the skeletal remains of once prosperous buildings. Holmes paid the driver, then led us toward a narrow doorway wedged between two brick facades. There was no sign, no markings, nothing to indicate that anything of note lay within, and yet I felt its presence. Holmes knocked once. A panel in the door slid open, revealing a single eye, clouded with cataracts, but sharp nonetheless. "Who seeks entry?" the doorman rasped. Holmes' voice was quiet but firm. "One who does not wish to forget." A pause. Then the door swung inward. The interior of the Mirror House was unlike anything I had seen before. Candles burned low in their sconces, casting flickering light over mirrored walls that distorted our reflections. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment and something metallic, something faintly like blood. A dozen figures lingered in the gloom, men in dark coats, women with veiled faces, all seated in silence, as though waiting for something unseen. At the far end of the chamber, a man sat in an elaborate wooden chair. His skin was like parchment, his fingers long and thin, his eyes sunken, but fiercely intelligent. He did not speak as we approached. He only watched. Holmes inclined his head. "You know who we are." The man's lips barely moved. "I know who you were." The chill crawled down my spine. Holmes remained unfazed. "Then you know why we have come." The man steepled his fingers. "You seek answers about the veiled order. about the man who never was. Lestrade tensed. "Can you tell us who he is?" A long silence. Then, "I can tell you what he was meant to be." The old man gestured toward one of the mirrors, and at once the candlelight warped, throwing shifting shadows across the glass. And then we saw him. A man, faceless yet familiar, flickering like an unfinished thought. His posture was rigid, his clothes unremarkable. But something in the way he stood sent ice down my spine. The old man's voice was barely above a whisper. He was one of us. I inhaled sharply. One of the order. The man shook his head, one who turned against it. Holmes' expression did not change, but I saw the way his fingers tightened at his sides. "You mean to say he was erased not as a victim, but as a punishment?" The old man nodded. "His name is beyond your grasp, detective, but his crime remains. He tried to defy the order's control. He sought to break the veil." A silence stretched between us. Then Holmes spoke, and did he succeed? The old man exhaled slowly. He failed. He was wiped from memory, from record, from history itself. But he left something behind. A fragment. A thread, frayed, but not yet broken. Lestrade frowned. "And what does that mean for us?" The old man's eyes locked onto Holmes. "It means that if you continue down this path, you will find yourselves standing in his place." I felt the weight of those words settle over us like a shroud. We were closer than we had ever been to the truth. But the truth had already destroyed one man. The question was, would we be next? Chapter 15. The old man's words hung in the candlelit air, heavier than the oppressive silence of the mirror house. He failed, but he left something behind. A fragment. A thread, frayed but not yet broken. Holmes stood motionless, his sharp gaze fixed on the flickering image in the mirror. The faceless man, our erased victim, stood frozen in time, a shadow of what once was. And yet he remained. A remnant of a life that was supposed to be gone. Lestrade let out a slow breath. "Holmes, tell me you understand what all this means." Holmes blinked once. "It means there is a flaw in the order's methods, a crack in the foundation. They may control memory, but they are not infallible." I frowned. "You mean something of him survived?" The old man tilted his head slightly. "You hold the thread, but pulling it will unravel more than you intend." Holmes finally turned from the mirror. "Where does it lead?" The old man was silent. Then he extended one gnarled hand toward the candlelight, his long fingers twisting through the air, as though weaving something unseen. And in the stillness of the chamber he whispered, "The archive." A shiver ran down my spine. Lestrade tensed. "What in God's name is the archive?" The old man smiled faintly. "The place where all things that should not be are kept." I felt a weight settle in my chest. This was no ordinary case. We were not merely hunting a murderer or uncovering a lost truth. We were searching for something that had never been meant to be found. Holmes' voice was steady, but there was an edge of something unreadable beneath it. "Where?" The old man leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Southwark, beneath the old church of St. Ignatius. The door is locked to all who do not know its name." Holmes arched a brow. "And what name is that?" A long pause. Then, in a voice barely above a breath, the old man spoke a single word. "Mercy." The flame of the candle flickered. The mirror darkened. And I knew, without a doubt, that we had crossed into something far beyond our understanding. The streets of London felt wrong as we left the mirror house. The city remained the same, lamplight flickering against damp stone, the scent of coal and fog thick in the air. But there was a new, gnawing sensation beneath it all, a hollowness, as if something unseen had shifted. as if we were walking toward a place that did not want to be found. Lestrade broke the silence. "Holmes, let's say we get to this archive. Let's say we even manage to get inside. Then what? We're dealing with something that can wipe our minds clean with a thought." Holmes kept walking, his voice calm. "Then we must be more stubborn than the truth." Lestrade sighed in frustration, but I knew better than to argue. Holmes had locked onto the scent of this mystery, and he would not be swayed. Still, something about this unsettled me more than anything we had faced before. Not merely because of what we sought, but because of what might be waiting for us when we found it. We arrived at Street Ignatius at the stroke of midnight. The church was old, its foundation worn and blackened with the weight of centuries. Its doors, once grand, were now warped with damp and neglect. There was no sign of life, no priest, no parishioners, only silence. Holmes stepped forward and placed a gloved hand against the door. He did not knock. He did not push. Instead, he spoke. "Mercy." A deep, resonant click echoed from within. Then, without so much as a breath of wind, the heavy wooden doors swung inward, revealing a descending stairwell into utter blackness. Lestrade let out a low curse. "Tell me we're not actually going down there." Holmes smiled faintly. "Do you see another way forward?" Lestrade muttered something under his breath, but followed nonetheless. I hesitated only for a moment before stepping inside. The doors did not close behind us. The shadows swallowed us whole. And the hunt for the erased man truly began. Chapter 16. The stairwell swallowed us. The deeper we descended, the more the world above seemed to drift away, like a dream fading upon waking. The flickering light of Holmes' lantern cast shifting shadows on the damp stone walls, each step echoing in the tight space. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of age and decay, as though we were walking through the lungs of something ancient, something that had been waiting far too long for visitors. Lestrade exhaled sharply behind me. This place shouldn't exist. Holmes did not look back, and yet here we are. I gripped the railing, steadying myself. "Holmes, this archive, what exactly do you expect to find?" His voice came back through the darkness, low and controlled. "A record, something even they could not erase." The words sent a shiver through me. If the Order had the power to rewrite history, to erase men from existence, what could possibly be kept here, in the depths beneath a forgotten church? A place that should not exist. A place that remembered what should have been forgotten. At last we reached the bottom. The stairwell opened into a vast chamber, the ceiling lost to shadow. The walls were lined with towering shelves, packed tightly with books and scrolls of every size and age. Some were bound in cracked leather, others in materials I did not recognize. They stretched outward in all directions, disappearing into the gloom like endless rows of tombstones. Holmes stepped forward. "The archive." Lestrade let out a low whistle. "This is a damn crypt." Holmes ignored him, striding deeper into the labyrinth of shelves. "No, Lestrade, this is a mausoleum of memory." I swallowed thickly, following close behind. The lantern's glow barely pierced the darkness, but even in the dim light I could see that the books were covered in a fine layer of dust, undisturbed, untouched, waiting. Holmes ran a gloved hand along the spines. If they erase history, then logic dictates there must be somewhere that holds the truth, something they cannot reach. Lestrade scoffed. "And why haven't they wiped this place out then?" Holmes paused. "Perhaps they cannot." A chill ran through me at the thought. Even the erasers must have limits. Holmes moved quickly now, his fingers tracing the shelves as if searching for something unseen. Then he stopped. He reached forward and pulled a single book from its place. It was smaller than the others, bound in dark green leather, its spine unmarked. There was no title, no indication of what lay within. Holmes opened it, and the moment he did, I felt something shift, a ripple through the air, as though the room itself had inhaled. Holmes' brow furrowed as his eyes scanned the pages. He turned one, then another. His fingers tightened on the paper. Lestrade stepped closer. "What is it?" Holmes did not answer immediately. His gaze was fixed on the page before him. Finally he spoke. "A name." I took a step forward. "The erased man." Holmes nodded once. "What remains of him?" He turned the book so that we could see. There, written in faded ink, was a name. Or rather, what should have been a name. But the ink had bled, as though something had tried to wipe it from existence, but had failed. The letters were fractured, broken, unfinished. Carson. Lestrade muttered a curse. "What the hell kind of name is that?" Holmes' voice was calm. "A name that refuses to die." I swallowed hard. Carson. That was his name. Holmes exhaled. Once, the ripple in the air grew stronger. And then, a sound. Not footsteps, not whispers. A breath. A presence. I turned sharply, heart hammering. We were not alone. Holmes snapped the book shut. "We must go." Lestrade looked around, his hand twitching toward his revolver. "Go now." Holmes' gaze was sharp. "We have what we came for, and we have woken something up." The shadows pressed in. The archive did not forget, and neither did the things that lurked within it. We ran. Through the labyrinth of shelves, past the ancient books that held secrets never meant to be read. I did not look back. I did not want to see what was following us. The stairwell loomed ahead, and we scrambled upward, lungs burning, feet pounding against the stone. The doors of the chapel came into view. Holmes reached them first. Then, the whispering returned, soft, insidious, but this time it did not try to erase us. It remembered us, and it wanted us to know. A voice, barely audible, slathered through the air. "You are not supposed to know." The doors burst open. We stumbled into the cold air, gasping. The city was unchanged. The fog still clung to the streets. But something was different. Holmes turned, slamming the doors shut. And in the distance, deep beneath London's streets, the whispering continued. Chapter 17. The night air was sharp, cutting through the fog that clung to the London streets. We stood just outside the chapel, our breath heavy, our bodies rigid with adrenaline. The whispering had ceased the moment we crossed the threshold, but I could still feel it, watching. Lestrade ran a hand over his face. "Tell me," he said, his voice low, "that we're done with this madness." Holmes ignored him. He clutched the book from the archive tightly, his gloved fingers curling around the worn leather cover. The name, or what remained of it, was written within. Carson. The erased man. And now we had proof that he had once been. I steadied my breath and turned to Holmes. "What now?" Holmes' expression was unreadable. "Now, Watson, we test a theory." Before I could question him, he did something that sent a cold shudder through me. He opened the book, and he spoke the name aloud. Carson. Nothing happened. For a brief, agonizing moment, we simply stood in the mist, waiting for something, anything, to occur. Then Holmes exhaled softly. "It is as I suspected." Lestrade tensed. "And what, pray tell, is that?" Holmes closed the book and slipped it into his coat. "The Order's power is not absolute. They have erased this man's name from history, but not from reality." He turned his sharp gaze on me. "Watson, tell me, do you remember his face?" I blinked. The words failed me. My mind grasped at the memory, but it was incomplete. The details blurred, like ink washed away in the rain. I knew of him. I knew he had existed, but his face was missing. I inhaled sharply. "Holmes, I can't." He nodded. "Precisely. His name lingers, but the order's work is thorough. They did not simply erase his records. They erased the very concept of him. He exists only as a hollow outline." Lestrade shuddered. "That's the most unsettling thing I've ever heard." Holmes smirked slightly. "Then steel yourself, Lestrade, for what we do next will be far worse." We returned to 221B Baker Street under the cover of night, each of us locked in our own thoughts. The city was unchanged, yet something in its air felt off, as though we had crossed an invisible threshold. Inside, the warmth of the fire did little to settle my nerves. I watched as Holmes carefully placed the book on his desk, his gaze lingering on it as though it might vanish if left unattended. I poured myself a brandy, my hands still unsteady. "Holmes, if what you say is true, if Carson still exists in some way, then what are we dealing with?" Holmes sat down, steepling his fingers beneath his chin. "Something unprecedented. A fracture in the order's control. A memory that refuses to die." Lestrade slumped into a chair. "And what happens if they find out we have this?" He gestured at the book. "You said it yourself, Holmes. They correct people. If they erased an entire man, what's to stop them from erasing us?" Holmes remained silent for a long moment. Then softly, "They will try." A terrible stillness settled in the room. I swallowed hard. "Then what do we do?" Holmes' sharp eyes flickered with something unreadable. "We bring Carson back." Lestrade scoffed. "Bring him back? How do you bring back someone who's been wiped from existence?" Holmes reached for his notebook and flipped to an empty page. "We do the only thing they fear." He dipped his pen into the inkwell. "We write him back into history." Chapter 18. The night deepened outside 221B Baker Street, but sleep was a luxury we could no longer afford. The fire burned low, casting restless shadows across Holmes' study. The book from the archive sat on the desk, its dark green leather seeming to pulse under the flickering glow. Holmes sat poised, pen in hand, the tip hovering over his notebook. He had declared our next move with his usual certainty. We write him back into history. But now, in the silence that followed, even he hesitated. Lestrade leaned forward, rubbing his temples. "Holmes, let's assume for a moment that you're right. That by writing his name, we can anchor him back into reality. What happens then?" Holmes exhaled slowly. "Then we see if the order notices." A chill ran down my spine. "They will notice, Holmes. They already know we're looking for him." This would be an outright challenge. Holmes met my gaze. "Then let them come." The weight of his words settled over us like a storm rolling in from the Thames. This was no longer just an investigation. It was a battle for reality itself. Holmes dipped the pen into the inkwell. And then, with deliberate precision, he wrote, "Carson lived." The moment the words hit the page, a ripple passed through the room, so subtle I might have imagined it. The candle flames flickered. The walls groaned faintly, as though the very house itself had inhaled. Lestrade stiffened. "Tell me you bloody felt that." Holmes did not look up. He continued writing, each stroke of the pen carving Carson's existence back into the world. He was a man. He had a name. He had a past. I swallowed hard, gripping the arms of my chair. My head swam. Something at the edge of my mind stirred, like a memory long buried, clawing its way back to the surface. And then, a knock at the door. 3 slow, deliberate raps. Lestrade shot to his feet, his revolver half drawn. Holmes merely glanced at the clock. They are early. The air felt impossibly heavy. No footsteps had approached. No shadow loomed under the threshold. But someone stood on the other side. The knocking came again. Holmes stood, adjusting his coat. "Watson," he said quietly, "do not open your notebook. Do not speak his name aloud." I nodded, my throat dry. Holmes moved to the door, unbolted it, and pulled it open. A figure stood there. Tall, motionless. A man wrapped in a long black coat, his face obscured beneath the brim of a hat. The gaslight from the street barely seemed to touch him, as though he stood just outside of reality. He spoke only 2 words. "Undo it." Silence. The fire crackled softly behind me, but it sounded distant, muted, like a memory of sound rather than the thing itself. Holmes did not flinch. "And if I refuse?" The man in the doorway did not move. His voice, when it came, was hollow. "Then you will be unmade." Lestrade's grip tightened on his revolver. "You try it, mate, and I'll put a bullet right between your—" The man turned his head slightly, as though noticing Lestrade for the first time. His presence shifted, the air thickening, pressing against my ribs like the weight of the ocean. Lestrade faltered. His breathing hitched. His hand trembled. I knew with sudden terrible certainty that if the man wished it, Lestrade would forget how to hold a gun at all. Holmes remained unshaken. "You underestimate me," he said simply. The man in the doorway was silent. Then slowly he extended his gloved hand. A black ledger rested in his palm. Its cover was worn, its pages ancient. And on the very first line, a name had begun to fade. Carson. I stiffened. "They're still erasing him." Holmes narrowed his eyes. "No," he murmured. "They are erasing him again." The man in black tilted his head just slightly. "You do not understand," he said, almost regretfully. "We are not the ones who erase." My breath caught. "What?" Holmes, for the first time, hesitated. Then whoa. The man's fingers twitched. The ledger snapped shut. The candle flames sputtered. And in a voice that was not quite human, he whispered, "Ask him yourself." Then the man was gone. The door had never opened. The street outside was empty. And in the dim firelight of 221B Baker Street, something moved. The memory hit me like a flood. The ink in Holmes' notebook smudged and ran, as though rejecting its own truth. My vision blurred, and suddenly I remembered. Not all of it, not his face, but his voice. A whisper, desperate, frantic. A voice speaking to us not in the present, but from the past. "Find me, before I forget myself, before it takes me completely." I gasped. My knees nearly buckled. Lestrade caught me, his face pale. "Watson, what the hell?" Holmes turned sharply. "Watson, what did you hear?" I lifted my gaze. My hands were trembling. "Carson," I rasped. "He's still alive." Holmes' jaw tightened. "Then we must reach him before the order does." I nodded, swallowing hard. "Yes, but there's one problem." Lestrade's voice was hoarse. "What's that?" I clenched my fists. "I don't think he remembers who he is." Chapter 19. The air in 221B Baker Street had grown heavier, charged with something unseen. It wasn't fear, not entirely. It was the unbearable weight of knowing we had meddled in something beyond our understanding. Holmes sat perfectly still in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. The flickering gaslight cast shifting shadows across his face, but his eyes remained sharp, calculating. I swallowed hard. "Carson is alive." Lestrade shook his head. "Someone is alive. But if what we saw in that ledger means anything, then the order is still erasing him. They're finishing the job, Holmes. He won't be Carson for much longer." Holmes exhaled slowly. "Then we must find him before he forgets himself completely." I tightened my grip on the armrest. And how do you propose we do that? We don't even know where he is." Holmes turned his sharp gaze on me. "We do now." I frowned. "What do you mean?" Holmes reached for the book from the archive, the one that had first revealed Carson's name to us. He flipped to the fading ink, running his fingers along the letters, as though feeling the presence of the man who had once been. Then, without hesitation, he turned the page. And there, scrawled in shaking handwriting, as though it had been written in a final act of defiance, was an address. H. Carson, Providence Asylum, South London. We arrived at Providence Asylum under the veil of night. The great iron gates loomed before us, their rusted bars lined with sharp spikes at the top, as though warding off intruders or keeping something in. The asylum itself was a grim structure, its stone walls blackened with soot and time. The building stretched into the darkness, its windows flickering with dim candlelight. A place where London discarded the unwanted, the forgotten. A place where a man erased by history might end up. Holmes strode ahead, his coat billowing slightly as he approached the main doors. Lestrade and I followed, the crunch of gravel beneath our feet the only sound in the deadened air. Lestrade muttered, "Remind me why we're breaking into a bloody madhouse again." Holmes did not slow, because if Carson is here, he will not leave willingly, and if the order suspects he still exists, they will come for him before sunrise. Lestrade let out a low curse, but said nothing more. Holmes rapped sharply on the heavy oak door. After a moment, the peephole slid open, revealing a pair of tired, bloodshot eyes. "Visiting hours are closed." Holmes slipped a coin through the slot. "Consider this an exception." A pause. Then, with the slow creak of ancient hinges, the door swung open. The inside of Providence Asylum was worse than I expected. The walls were lined with cells, thick iron bars separating us from the patients within. Dim oil lamps flickered along the hall, casting grotesque shadows against the damp stone. Some of the patients muttered to themselves. Others sat in silence, their eyes vacant. But the worst were the ones who were awake, staring at us. Lestrade shifted uncomfortably. "Bloody place gives me the creeps." Holmes did not acknowledge him. He turned to the attendant who had let us in, a thin, gaunt man with greying hair and a permanent scowl. "We are here for a patient, Henry Carson." The attendant frowned. "Carson." I tensed. The man rubbed his temple as though trying to recall the name. Carson, Carson. His brows knitted together, frustration clouding his face. "We have a Henry Crowley, a Harold Carter." But his voice trailed off. Holmes' eyes gleamed with something unreadable. "Try harder." The man inhaled sharply. "That can't be right. I swear we had a Carson once." Holmes reached into his coat, withdrawing his notebook. He flipped to the page where we had written Carson's name, a tether to keep him from slipping away. Then, in a voice firm and unyielding, he said, "Carson is here. Take us to him." The attendant stiffened, his eyes unfocused for the briefest moment. And then, "Yes," he murmured. "Yes, of course. This way." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Lestrade exhaled through his nose. "I don't like this, Holmes. It's like his name was disappearing from the poor sod's mind in real time." Holmes nodded once. "Because it was." The attendant led us down a long corridor, the air thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and damp stone. Finally, we reached a wooden door marked 303. "He's been here for years," the attendant murmured. "Quiet, doesn't speak much." We assumed it was, well, madness. Holmes turned the handle and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was sparse, a small cot, a single chair, a barred window. And in the center of it all, a man sat motionless, staring at the wall. His hair was unkempt, his face gaunt, his eyes sunken with the weight of something beyond comprehension. He did not acknowledge our presence. Holmes stepped forward. "Carson." No response. I frowned, stepping closer. "Carson, can you hear us?" Still nothing. The man barely even blinked. He simply existed, as though waiting for something unseen. Lestrade muttered, "I think we're too late." Holmes' expression darkened. "No." He reached into his coat, withdrawing the book from the archive, the last remaining record of Carson's name. Then, carefully, he held it before the man's vacant gaze. And at that moment, Carson moved. It was subtle. A slow inhale, a twitch of his fingers, but it was the first sign of life we had seen from him. His eyes flicked toward the book, as though recognizing something he did not understand. His lips parted. The whisper, hoarse, fragile. I had a name. My breath caught. Holmes crouched before him, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, Carson, you had a name. They tried to take it from you, but we brought it back." Carson's gaze wavered. "But his breathing quickened. "I don't remember." I clenched my fists. "Then we help you remember." Holmes nodded. "We anchor you back." Carson shuddered, his whole frame trembling. No, I can't." The lights flickered. The walls seemed to groan, as if some unseen force were pressing against them. And from somewhere deep within the asylum, the whispering began again. Low, unrelenting. But this time, it was not trying to erase. It was trying to stop us. Holmes stood sharply. "They know we found him." Lestrade drew his revolver. "Then we better move now." I turned to Carson, gripping his shoulder. "We are leaving, do you understand? You are coming with us." His breath hitched. His hands shook. His mind was fractured. But we had pulled him back just enough to make him real again. Holmes grabbed his arm, and as we turned to flee, the door slammed shut. Chapter 20. The door slammed shut, sealing us inside room 303. The whispering swelled, rising from the very walls, curling around us like an invisible fog. It was not the hushed murmurs of a mind unraveling. No, this was something else, something watching, something acting. Carson trembled, his breath shallow, his fingers curling into the thin fabric of his patient's gown. His eyes darted from Holmes to me, to Lestrade, wide with confusion, fear, and something else. *E don't. His voice cracked. "I don't remember where I am." Holmes gripped his shoulder, forcing him to look directly at him. "Carson, listen to me. They tried to take you away, but we found you. You exist. Do you understand?" Carson's hands trembled. "But I don't know who I am." The whispering grew sharper. I gritted my teeth. "Holmes, we have to get out of here now." Lestrade rattled the door handle. "Damn thing's locked, and I doubt they'll just let us walk out the front." Holmes didn't hesitate. He turned sharply, his mind already working. "We don't need the door. We need to sever their grip on him before they erase him again." My blood ran cold. "How?" Holmes pulled his notebook from his coat and flipped to the page with Carson's name. The ink was fading. It was happening again. Holmes drew his pen. "We overwrite it. We burn it into reality so deeply that they cannot undo it." The whispering twisted, an angry scraping sound, like the wind through hollow bones. "Holmes," Lestrade snapped, backing away from the door. "We've got a bloody problem." I turned, and the walls were vanishing. Like ink dissolving in water, the very room itself was breaking apart. The floor beneath us trembled, the ceiling darkening, bending, warping. This wasn't just a building. The order was rewriting reality in real time, erasing the moment, erasing us. Holmes slammed his pen against the page. Watson, say his name. I hesitated, my mind screaming. But Holmes' voice was sharp, commanding, "Say it." I turned to Carson. His body was fading, his fingers blurring, his breath shallow, his existence unraveling. And in that moment I knew, if I hesitated even for a second longer, he would be gone forever. I gritted my teeth, and I spoke his name, Henry Carson. A crack split the air. The whispering stopped. The unraveling walls shuddered. And suddenly Carson gasped. His eyes focused. His fingers solidified. His body returned. Holmes didn't stop. His pen slashed across the page, carving Carson's name deeper and deeper into the fabric of reality. Henry Carson existed. Henry Carson remembers. Henry Carson is real. The world jerked, as though reality itself had tripped over an unseen edge. The asylum walls solidified. The whispering died in an instant, like breath snuffed from a candle. Carson collapsed forward, his breath ragged, his body whole. Holmes dropped his pen, exhaled sharply, and then the door creaked open. No force, no resistance, just an open path, as though the order had let us go. We led Carson through the asylum halls. No one stopped us. No guards, no attendants, no order agents. It was as if the world itself had shifted to accommodate what had just happened. Carson had been erased, but we had written him back in. And for the first time, I understood why the order had tried so hard to erase him. They weren't just hiding a secret. They were hiding proof that their power was not absolute, that a man could survive erasure. That history could be rewritten. Outside, the London night air was cold, but I had never welcomed it more. Carson leaned against me, still weak, still unsure of himself. His breath was unsteady, his mind fragile, but he was here. Holmes stood beside him, his expression unreadable. Lestrade exhaled sharply. "Tell me this is over, Holmes. Tell me we're not about to vanish into the mist like everything else in this bloody case." Holmes studied Carson for a long moment. Then softly, "No, Lestrade, it is not over." Lestrade cursed. And why the hell not? Holmes' fingers brushed the notebook in his pocket, the same one he had used to write Carson back into history. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Because if we can bring Carson back," his gaze flicked to the fog-shrouded city beyond. "What else have they erased?" 3 days later, Holmes and I sat in 221B Baker Street, the fire crackling softly. Lestrade had returned to Scotland Yard. Carson had disappeared into the anonymity of the city, his memories still fragmented but alive. Holmes turned the notebook over in his hands. He had stopped writing. For now. I leaned back, my gaze unfocused. "Do you believe they will come for us?" Holmes' lips curled in the faintest of smirks. "Perhaps, but they will not erase me so easily." I nodded. Then, hesitantly, I asked the question that had haunted me since that night. "Holmes, what did the man in black mean?" Holmes glanced up. I exhaled. "When he said they don't erase things, who does?" The fire crackled. Holmes' expression darkened. Then softly, so softly I almost missed it, he said, "I intend to find out."